It's Tardigrade Thursday, and I'm Jocelyn Matthews with Storage Labs. I'm here today with Carlisia Thompson. Carlisia is an open source engineer at VMware. Carlisia, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Glad to be here.
So I thought that we could open by first off talking about some of your current activities and a little bit about your background and interests before we dive into the technical portion.
Yeah, sure thing. So I am an open source engineer at VMware, like you just said. I work as one of the maintainers on the project Valero, which is an open source software that does backup and recovery migrations of Kubernetes clusters, which we're actually going to talk about today. And I also I'm a host of the podcast called The Podlets. And that podcast talks about cloud native technology. And we go into defining the principles and the concepts so people understand this whole new wild west of of a new world that sometimes sometimes it's not completely new, but very hard to grasp because of all the new vocabulary and new ways of doing things.
Great. Actually, you've made
Yeah.
some fans with your podcast here. We shared it around, and now some of the engineers here are following it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. When you talk about it being the Wild West, what does that mean to you?
Well, I will speak for myself. When people come across cloud native technologies for the first time, and I think especially people who have been in tech for a while and have been used to doing things a certain way, have been used to certain concepts and certain vocabulary, when they come to the cloud native world and Kubernetes, the vocabulary is different and the architecture is a bit different than what maybe a lot of people are used to. I had a hard time grasping, and sometimes I thought, oh, I know what this is, but I was extrapolating to things that had knowledge of, and I wasn't quite getting it. And it would take me a while to understand, okay, that's not it. It's something different. Yeah, I'm not being very specific, but I just had a hard time like understanding what things were. I mean, it took me a while. It wasn't immediate. It's of course, if for me, if it's not immediate, I describe it as okay. I had a hard time. For example, it took me, I thought, forever to understand what a pod was. Yeah, I read the description. I understood what it was, but I didn't. What the heck is a pod? And it's not a container. It's not an app. Why does it even exist? And another thing that I had a hard time with was being in technology, you're used to searching for answers and asking people and trying to teach yourself. And I was doing that. But when you ask experts to explain to you what something is, sometimes they talk to you as if you were also an expert in the matter. And I was missing, they would jump into the how things worked. I noticed that with so many people I would approach and ask for help. They would jump right into the how. And I was like, no, I need to know the what, and especially I need to know the why. And that was a very strong motivation for me to start the podcast because I wanted to get into those concepts like, hey, what is this and why does it exist? Because the what's, we can get the what out there. There are a lot of material, there are a lot of people who can tell you how things work, but at any rate, that's the hard time that I had when I came to this world.
Yeah, I think knowing the what, obviously it's useful, but it's not necessarily transferable in a way that knowing the why is something that you can take and you can use as a meta concept to actually do other stuff with. And it's so interesting that a lot of the information out there is sort of geared in the way that you just described, when so many people who are the likely audience think the way that you just laid out how your mind works. So
Yeah.
it's almost like not only are there like five different pieces to the puzzle, you have to know that there's five pieces, and then you have to know that you're supposed to be looking for them, and you have to figure out where they are. And without that larger context, it's really not as much fun.
Yeah, knowing the why really helps to understand things. It's amazing to me how many people leave that out of the equation and just assume that people know why something exists.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I want to come back to that, but I also, to frame this conversation, would love to find out about the kind of work that your team's doing at Project Valero right now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. A lot of the work that we do is shepherding the community. We're very community oriented. We have a weekly community meeting, and we also trim the GitHub issues. We have a Slack channel where we have a rotation. One of us is on quote unquote support. It's not commercial level support. We just try to help people out for a couple hours a day. So we rotate. Each week is one of us, and so that's the community part. So as far as actual roadmap, we do have a roadmap markdown file on our repo right at the roots. And looking at it now, just to refresh my memory, we have coming up for the 1.5 release, which is going to be out at the end of August. We have Rustic improvements. We have a lot of CSI improvement. That's a Kubernetes native way to interact with persistent volumes. We are going to do some work to improve our CLI tool. Set of things in that department, they're not all going to get done for 1.5, but definitely by 1.6, we're going to have that revamped just to make it more intuitive for people to understand what are the things that they can do with the commands. We have improvements for backup and restore. A lot of work went in recently to do design and documentation of restore hook implementation. It just so it will allow people to, whenever they have to, some people have to restore data, but they have to do some maybe, for example, bring up a database before the data gets restored. So the restore hooks will allow people to customize the restore process to whatever it is that they need. And it sounds simple, but it can be quite complex because you have to decide the order of things, and then you also have to push the backup to the storage system, whatever you're using. So you have to be careful about getting the order correctly and getting the dependencies correctly. And and we have things on the list for after August too. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, there's always a list, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's always a list. Did your team have the same sort of, you talked a little bit about the work that your team is doing. Did your team have a similar experience when they were, as they were onboarding and as they were getting to know about Kubernetes?
Well, so when I came to Valero 2 years ago, I was definitely not a new developer because I have been a developer for a long time, but I was new to the Kubernetes world. Every teammate has had that experience before coming to Valero. So they might have had that in the past, but I was not a witness to it. So they already came knowing how the pieces fit together. So
It's just always so interesting to hear how different people kind of take their path into it and how they become involved. So what about your community? And can you talk a little bit about your community?
So because Valero is a command line tool, I think we get what our community is made up mostly of either developers or systems admin that have that developer background. So a lot of people who hop in asking us for help, they're very knowledgeable about how Kubernetes works and how to access things, how to get the logs, and what to look for where things should be. So I think they're very developer oriented. If that was your question.
It was. I'm just a community nerd. I can't. I'm a community manager, here, and I just always kind of want to hear about other people's communities. I'm always on the lookout. So maybe that was a little self-indulgent as a question.
No, that's okay.
I'd love to get back to some of your opening comments and maybe talk talk about how many times when we're talking about the cloud and Kubernetes and related topics, that we don't always outline these key concepts or define working definitions up front. And I think that can lead to this real perception of complication that either people can become intimidated, or after they start to get their feet wet, they can start to feel overwhelmed. Do you think it's necessary that this is a complicated process, or can the ways that we talk about it be simplified?
That is such a good question. So also one thing that I noticed is that some people, and not judging that they are right or they're wrong, is just a very interesting take. Some people think that the struggle is necessary. The struggle is what's going to make you sharp and know all the edges, because you are going to, in the process of you figuring things out, you're going to become, you're going to be so much more knowledgeable at the end, as opposed to if you had been fed the information, or if somebody had held your hand and, okay, this is what this means. You know what I mean? Some people have that mentality, and I get it, because yeah, I've been there. When I have to struggle to learn something, I get a lot better at it than if I take a course and everything's given to me. Now, so does it have to be like that to answer your question? Some people would say yes, because it's really what's going to make people very sharp, very knowledgeable. I not so much on that camp, because there's a lot, I think, a lot to be overwhelmed with. So if you get overwhelmed with everything, you might give up, you might quit, you might try to do something else. So I think there are ways to try to address that, to make things not so complicated, and it takes a community. It can't. I don't think it would be feasible to expect one entity to come and solve that problem. And the problem that I'm saying is, if you think you don't know anything and you're getting overwhelmed and you don't even know where to start, I mean, I think that's a problem that needs to be solved. And I think it takes a community. For example, I felt that I was so far from getting a grasp of things that my knee-jerk reaction was, I know there are people like me, and I don't want them to suffer as much as I did. So I'm going to do a podcast, because I know how to do podcasts and I love it. And that's going to be my way to contribute to that, to solving that quote unquote problem. So yeah, it takes a community, and yes, I think it's possible. I mean, of course, the best way is to really jump in and not give up. And because after a little while, you become well versed on it. After 2 years working with Kubernetes, I don't think it's hard. But also, if I were teaching people how to use it, I think I will have a very, like, my way of teaching people maybe be different than the way other people would teach it. Like, you know what I mean? It's the way I see it, like what you need to know first before you get into more complicated areas.
Yeah, I think as engineers, like I've definitely been in that position where, and I've thought this way myself at times, that I don't know how something like learning Kubernetes becomes a moral issue that's about like grit and personal worth. Like when if you look at it, that it's almost like that's what we're doing. But I think people are kind of onto something in that. I do think that grounding experiences that reinforce something do help you to learn. And I think when you approach it on that, I'm going to crawl on my elbows across broken glass kind of mentality, the pain is what makes you remember it. You're like, oh, I made this terrible mistake, or I almost got fired, or I got like, everybody like almost saw like what a disgraceful moron I am because of this mistake that I made. And you never forget that. That moment becomes very sharp in your memory, and things that are sharpened are easy to retain. But like, there's a lot of ways to intensify a moment that don't involve that level of angst to stress. So it kind of makes sense, but then, I think that there can be another way. So going off that, Kubernetes, it can be really perceived as newcomers. It's complicated and intimidating. And you said that maybe you would have your own style of teaching. So what's a basic thing that someone could keep in mind if they were approaching it for the first time? What would you tell you if back then?
What I would tell me is exactly what I did that helped me, because eventually I learned, right? I'm still here, and I didn't quit. Obviously, I'm still here, and
Yeah.
I feel very comfortable now. And just maybe a disclaimer: once you understand, you can start mapping things. And I'm talking to people who have been developers or in tech for a long time. Once you understand, then you're able to map things out. At the beginning, I found it complicated to map things out to what was there before. So yes, once you grasp it, it doesn't continue to be so hard, because then you have an understanding of the concepts. So what I did that helped me stick with it was to be very proactive and very assertive when I was talking to people, asking people to explain something to me. I was already very grateful. So my tendency is not naturally to like push back and say, hey, you're giving me information that I'm not asking for. But I did that because I had to advocate for myself. So I would say, hey, once I noticed that kept happening and I was lost, I started pushing back and saying, you're telling me the how to do it, but I don't even know what this is. Can you please back up a little and tell me, what is this? How does it compare with something else? And why do we need it? Because actually the thing that I needed the least was the how, because the how I could go and look at a manual.
Mm-hmm.
So once I realized that the people were doing that, when I was asking, hey, what is this? They were telling me, oh, this is how you use it. I was like, no, what is it? So I kept pushing back, and I tried, but not everybody learns the same. So I understand that too. I'm saying what works for me. It helps me make progress, and understand the concepts. Like, okay, a pod keeps popping up all the time. It's everywhere. I didn't rest until I understood what it was conceptually. It's an abstraction, right? So how does it fit in with everything else around it? So understanding the concept, really, it's a pain in the butt. It takes time, but it pays off, rather than just, I'm copying and pasting commands, and I know if I paste this command, this thing is going to happen. But understanding the concepts, at least for me, it's very helpful, because then I can extrapolate other things.
Right. And I love that point about advocating for yourself. I think that, knowing your own learning style paired with the ability to advocate for yourself will get you so far. Like if you can just knock out those two things, it'll really take you a far way.
Yeah. There are a lot of people out there willing to help, but we have to be cognizant that people are not necessarily teachers. I can say, oh, I'm totally willing to help you and try to teach you, and not be teaching you in a more proper pedagogical way, or in a way that it's useful for you. Feel free to tell me. It's like, hey, no, you will help me if you did it. If you taught me X instead of like what you are doing, which is Y. So yeah, people have to first ask for help. There are a lot of people out there we need to help, and then communicate what's working and what's not. And I guess that goes for everything, right?
Yeah, it's a good lesson. Let's move on and talk about Valero a little bit. So I'd love it if you could describe some of, again, if you're coming in new to it, I'd love it if you could describe some of the key terms and ideas that someone should understand about Valero. And maybe we could start with a quick description of the Valero tool itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So let me try to do a good job here.
Okay.
So Valero is conceptually a backup tool. It's a tool that will back up your Kubernetes clusters, and then you can restore that cluster in another cluster or parts of that cluster in the same cluster. But anyway, it just copies and pastes things, but it's exclusively for Kubernetes clusters. Now, the way it works is you install it in a cluster and where you want to make backups from. So then you can make one-off backups, you can schedule backups. So you keep making backups of these clusters. And where do these backups go? Because the whole point of backing up a cluster is if the cluster goes down, you are able to restore the whole thing. Now, if the backups were in the cluster, they would just go down with the cluster, right? So what you do is, what the Valero tool does is takes the backups and sends them to an S3 or S3 compatible storage. So it puts them there. And those backups will stay there until you purposefully delete it with the commands. Because if that cluster comes down, if you uninstall Valero, those backups are not going anywhere. Because the way Valero works is, let's say you uninstall it for some reason, and then you install it again, and you configure to point to that storage, Valero will synchronize and bring them all back. Like bring the let's say the pointers. So the pointers, if you uninstall Valero, the pointers to those backups will go away. So if you install Valero again, you configure to point to the storage, then backup Valero will synchronize, and Valero keeps synchronizing continuously to make sure the cluster has access to all of the backups, and also same idea for restore. So when you want to restore those backups into a different cluster, you install Valero in that. You have to make sure that the cluster has Valero installed. So if it's a different cluster, you have to install it in that cluster. And then you'll configure to point to the same S3 storage. So it will synchronize with those backups. And then you can create a restore. And Valero will restore from the existing backup that's on your S3 bucket somewhere.
Okay, great. Thank you. What are some of the key differentiators for Valero versus other solutions?
Yes, that's one of the most relevant questions. So there are so many different ways to make backups of things. For example, if you have a database in a server somewhere, could even be a server that's part of a Kubernetes cluster. You can some databases have their own backup system, so you can use that, right? So what we're talking about, or there are other backup tools that back up at a level of an entire database. They're specific for certain things. So what makes Valero different is that we connect to the cluster through the cluster API. We are not connecting at a file level system, because other tools connect at a file level system, so they can take a backup of a whole, whatever is in a file system, in a directory, let's say, and put it somewhere else. So Valero doesn't do that. And it might sound like it's a shortcoming, but it's not. It's actually very, very cool. Because Kubernetes accesses everything through the Kubernetes API, we can say, hey, backup everything in this cluster, but we can also say backup selectively. So just backup, let's say, namespace A and namespace B. Or let's say I have a namespace called development, and I want to restore, I want to take that, everything that's there, and move it or migrate it to a namespace called staging for people to test, for example, or marketing. So we can do selective backups and also selective restores, same idea. So what we usually recommend is make sure you have at least one backup that is everything. And then when you restore, you can choose if you want to restore selectively from that entire backup. You don't have to restore everything just because the backup it has everything. So you can select what you want. So that's very cool. And a tool that's not using the Kubernetes API wouldn't be able to do that. And we also have an integration with Rustic, and Rustic is another open source tool that does backup at a file level. And so if you don't have access to a plugin, let's say your things that are on a persistent volume. Let's say if you are on Amazon and you use a persistent volume on Amazon, we do have a plugin for Amazon. So you just install Valero with that plugin and you say, okay, back up my persistent volumes. You select, you give instructions, and then that plugin will do the work. Will take snapshots, and then when you restore, Valero would, reconnect, move the information and reconnect so that a new persistent volume in the place that things are being restored to will come up. And that works because Valero, the AWS plugin, uses the Amazon API to do all of that work. So it's, as far from a perspective of Valero, everything feels very native. And same thing with Google Cloud, and same thing with Azure, and a bunch of other plugins that some communities have implemented. DigitalOcean, we have a list of them. So when you don't have a plugin available, then you can use Rustic. And even if you do have a plugin available, but let's say you want to move your resources from an Amazon cluster to a Google Cloud cluster, you wouldn't be able to use any plugin because they wouldn't be compatible. So we do give the ability to use Rustic, and then you will make a copy of at a file level, and then you can migrate those resources to a completely different service provider. And also, I like to point out too that if you are using a managed Kubernetes on a cloud provider, let's say like GKE or AKS on Amazon, you don't have access to the file system to make a backup from. So Valero comes in very handy in those cases, especially.
Thanks. So the way that you and I encountered each other is that we had an internal hackathon at my company, and some of our engineers came up with a great plugin, a Tardigrade Valero plugin. And this is how we came to meet. I'd love to talk about that with you. And before we do, I should probably give a quick explainer to anyone who's not sure of what Tardigrade stands for. So just real quickly, the name of the company that I work for is Storage Labs, and that's the area of our business that focuses on the supply side of our business. We do decentralized cloud object storage across a network of nodes. And Tardigrade is powered by Storage Labs and used for the demand side of our business. And Tardigrade comes with SLAs, it's enterprise level. The Tardigrade Valero plugin was developed by one of our hackathon teams, and it performs backups of the workloads running in a Kubernetes cluster. We are currently under development for snapshots, and it also recovers and enables users to rehydrate their cluster to any environment. Some benefits of Tardigrade are that decentralization enables a more resilient Kubernetes DR and migration strategy, reduces the global recovery time objective for your cluster, and easily does a backup and restore of all your Kubernetes applications. So the plugin was purpose-built to support multi-cloud Kubernetes architecture. Carlisia, if you have thoughts on the Valero plugin for Tardigrade, I'd love to hear your experience with it and any thoughts that you have.
Yeah, of course. It's always great to see new plugins added to our list. The interesting thing with Valero and the architecture for Valero is that you can have, so I'm sorry, let me back up. There are two main kinds of plugins when we talk about Valero plugins, and you already mentioned both of them, but I want to make sure that people understand. So one plugin type is the storage type, and that's what you have already available now for storage. So the backup storage plugin, it will allow you to connect to specific storage. So for example, in the case of storage, it's geared for that system. So when you want to connect to backup your cluster to storage, you use that plugin. Now, the interesting thing about the Valero architecture is that you can have a cluster running on Amazon, let's say, and you can install Valero on that cluster, and you can configure the storage backend to where your backups are going to go to be in a completely different cluster, or in a completely different provider even. So it's very helpful to have the storage plugin, because people can run the cluster somewhere and maybe want to store the backups in the storage system where it's in a completely different provider. So that's one very interesting thing. And the other kind of plugin, which it sounds like you are in the process of developing, is the Snapshot plugin. So the information for snapshots are still stored together with the backup, and it goes to an object, an S3 bucket, S3 object storage type. Now the snapshot themselves, they get either moved using Rustic, which, like I was saying, is at a file level scope, or you develop a plugin for that specific system. So through the API, you can manage, say, okay, so I want to restore a snapshot at this point. So you basically trigger the snapshot recreation in your system, using the plugin that corresponds to that system. And that's also to us, is very exciting, because the more plugins there are, the more options people have. And it's great to have a plugin for storage.
Thank you so much. We're really excited about the plugin too. And I believe people can find the plugin on your website right now. Is that true?
Yeah, so our website is valero.io, and at the very, very top there's some navigation, and one of them is called plugins, and storage is listed there.
Great. Carlisia, I'm thinking about issues that some people might encounter when they're backing up their Kubernetes clusters. And so, for example, you have these traditional cloud data center backup and recovery solutions, and they often assume that the infrastructure where an application is backed up from and where it will be recovered are the same. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting area to explore. My very tongue-in-cheek answer to that is the main problem people run into with Kubernetes backups is that they don't do it. People come to Kubernetes, and it's, again, not everyone, but some people who start exploring it, it's new, it's different. And the last thing in their mind is, oh, how I'm going to do backup, because they're already struggling just setting things up. So, and I think it should be the opposite. Like, the first thing you should do ahead of time is backup, because then you have this control. Like, you lose things, and I can just bring them up pretty instantaneously with just a couple commands. But I digress. So another problem I think that people run to is that they're used to maybe having the scripts to run backups, and they want to develop or maintain and keep their own scripts in, which is it doesn't scale. It doesn't scale. Kubernetes, the whole point of using Kubernetes is because you have a lot of workloads running, and at that point you will benefit from having something that's already that will automate things, and that you don't have to maintain on an individual basis. Which brings me to the main reason, the main, how do I say this? The main complication that people might miss, that they need to solve for, is that a cluster is ephemeral. It just is. There is no fighting it. So you have to be able to bring everything up online on one way or another. And you can say, oh yeah, I have all the cluster representation in YAML files on GitHub, so the GitOps style, and that works. But I actually don't have experience with that, because in my mind I'm thinking, well, that works, but it's limited, because I don't see how you can bring everything up online, especially if we're talking about persistent storage. You want something that it just works and that you have access to. And I think that's why Valero is so great, and having access to having the ability to store things to different providers. It gives you that flexibility, and it's hard to imagine why people wouldn't use a tool like that.
Wow, great answer. Thank you. You know, as we're sort of winding down the conversation, one thing that I did before we spoke today was reach out to some of the engineers that were on the hackathon team that actually created the Tardigrade Valero plugin. And I just said, you know, what, if you were listening, what is a takeaway message that you'd be interested in that would make you say, like, hey, that seems like something cool that I'd like to play around with? And what she said was that it's a great option for disaster recovery, and that there are different ways to do disaster recovery, and what makes one solution better than another would be ease of use. So we know that disaster recovery is a really important topic in infrastructure like Kubernetes, but it's labor intensive to set up usually, so that people don't typically have a good setup for it, which goes right to what you just said. Do you have thoughts about disaster recovery for containers and state within Kubernetes containers?
Yeah, I guess so. As a disclaimer, I'm not testing out all the tools out there. I sort of am familiar with some, so I suggest people just give them a try. So that my main thought here is give it a try, give things a try, because I can say for Valero, it's sort of very straightforward. I am always very cautious to say something is easy. But if you sort of know your way around a cluster, then installing Valero is such a low cost. I mean, it's literally free, but it's such a low, it takes 2 minutes to install it. And one command, create backup. There it is. And another command, create restore. Test it out. It's too low cost for you not to try. And maybe other tools too are low cost enough that people should be trying. That's my the main message I would say.
Okay, so go forward without fear.
Well,
That's a good way to live life.
Absolutely. I mean, test things out. I'm not saying, hey, put this in production and just rely on that without fear or without testing things out. I think what I'm saying is I can speak for Valero that it's very low cost. It's very straightforward. It's very easy to use. So that is almost like it boggles my mind when people say they're not doing backups on their clusters. And you know, in this case, I'm talking about production clusters. There should be backups. I mean, a lot of people are using Valero for that. Some people don't even talk about it because it just works. So yeah, test it out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here. This has been such a great conversation. It's really a treat to have you on. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
It was great, Jocelyn. Thank you for having me.